They saw the smoke first. Not black, but pale white, exhaust drifting low over the frozen field, betraying an enemy still hidden. Corporal Kramer raised his hand, and the gun crew froze. 6 men, hunched behind a web of camo netting, clung to their 75mm Pak 40 like drowning men to a plank. 900 meters out, the blunt shape of a T-34's turret slid into view, then another right behind it. 2 shadows on snow, moving far too fast. "Wait," Kramer hissed. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might break a rib. He knew if he missed, there might not be a second chance. The Pak 40 had been born from panic. In the summer of 1941, Soviet T-34s and KV-1s rolled onto the battlefield and tore through German confidence like paper. Older German anti-tank guns simply couldn't punch through their frontal armor. Overnight, the Wehrmacht demanded a new weapon, 75mm caliber, a long barrel, able to penetrate more than 90 meters of armor at 500 meters. Within months, the first shipments rumbled east. It was heavy, nearly 1.5 tons. Moving it by hand through deep snow was a back-breaking ordeal. But in ambush, on a well-chosen position, it was a tank executioner. Kramer's crew had already seen what it did to armor. One shot and the tank erupted in a geyser of fire, turret hatches blown sky high. December 1942. Their sector of the Eastern Front was quiet only on maps. In reality, Soviet probes came daily, feeling for weak spots. That morning, the quiet had shattered under the grinding rumble of engines. The crew had manhandled the Pak 40 into a shallow scrape behind a frozen hedgerow, its barrel poking through just enough to see the kill zone. Kramer steadied the sight. The first T-34 was at 700 meters now, angled slightly, perfect. "Target 1, fire!" The recoil slammed through the shield and into the frozen ground. Through the sight, Kramer saw the round hit square on the glacis. The T-34 jolted, slowed. Then a thin line of smoke curled from under its turret ring. A hit, maybe a kill. "Reload." Private Ernst shoved another shell into the breach, hands shaking in the cold. The second tank veered, its turret searching. This time, the shot hit just above the tracks. The armor peeled open like paper. But the return fire came fast. A shell burst short, showering them with dirt and ice. Then another hit the hedgerow to their left, splintering it into jagged spears. Kramer's number 3 gunner screamed, clutching a red mess where his leg had been. They fired again. Another Soviet tank halted, smoke gouting from its hatch. But now there were 4 more coming in from the flank. "We can't hold here," Ernst shouted over the deafening cracks of incoming fire. Kramer knew the truth. The Pak 40 was a killer, but it was also a coffin on wheels. No armor, no engine, no real protection once the enemy found them. And once spotted, survival depended on luck alone. By the end of that day, half the crew was dead or wounded. The gun was abandoned in place, breech destroyed with a grenade to keep it from the Soviets. Kramer walked back through the snow with only 2 others, each step heavier than the last. That was the reality for Pak 40 crews. Extraordinary killing power, paired with an almost certain death sentence. In this series, we'll uncover exactly why 80% of these crews never survived the war, and why they kept fighting anyway. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which weapon story you want us to bring to life next. By the spring of 1943, the Pak 40 had earned a fearsome reputation across the Eastern Front. Crews whispered about shots that split tanks like logs, and Soviet tankers learned to dread the telltale crack of its high-velocity gun. On paper, it was the perfect answer to the Soviet armor problem. It could punch through the front of a T-34 from over 1 kilometer away, and even the heavy KV series wasn't safe if caught from the side. Kramer's replacement crew learned quickly why it was loved and hated in equal measure. The weapon itself was brutally simple: a sturdy split trail carriage, thick gun shield, and that long 75mm barrel capable of spitting steel at nearly 800 meters per second. The optics were crisp, and the recoil mechanism was reliable, even in mud or snow. Everything about it screamed purpose-built lethality. And when it worked, when the crew had time to dig in, camouflage, and pick their shots, it was devastating. In one engagement outside Orel, Kramer's gun alone knocked out 5 advancing T-34s before the rest of the Soviet column turned away. The ground in front of them was littered with smoking wrecks. The crew cheered, adrenaline flooding away the cold and fatigue. But those moments of triumph carried a dangerous side effect: confidence. It was easy to believe that the Pak 40 could stop anything, anywhere, so long as the crew was steady. And that belief began to shape how commanders used them. Pak 40 units, originally intended for planned defensive lines, were increasingly thrown into mobile fire brigade roles. Wherever enemy armor threatened a breakthrough, trucks would rush the guns forward. Crews would unhook, wheel the heavy pieces into firing position, and open up, sometimes within minutes of arrival. If they were lucky, the first volley would break the assault. If not, they were stranded in open ground with no cover. The more successes they had, the more they were called upon. A crew that had survived one meat grinder was expected to survive the next. In some sectors, a single battery of 4 guns might be moved twice in a day, fighting at one crossroads in the morning and another village edge by evening. Each move was a gamble. The more you rolled the dice, the closer you came to losing. Even so, the kill counts were staggering. In Kursk's southern sector, some Pak 40 positions recorded over 20 confirmed tank kills in a single afternoon. Soviet tank crews often withdrew rather than charge head-on into a well-sighted German anti-tank screen. Allied intelligence reports acknowledged the gun's deadliness, advising tankers to avoid direct duels if possible. Inside the crews, pride mixed with fatalism. They knew they were good, that their gunnery was better than most tank crews could match. But they also knew the cost. In Kramer's unit, by the end of 43, only one of the original men was still alive, and he carried shrapnel in his hip that made him limp in the snow. And there was another truth. Every firing position was temporary. The first shot gave away your location, the second confirmed it, and by the third, enemy artillery or tank fire would be ranging in. Surviving meant killing fast, then disappearing, a luxury they didn't always have. What the crews didn't see yet was how the tide of the war was turning. Newer Soviet models like the T-34-85, with thicker armor and bigger guns, were starting to appear. And in the West, reports of Shermans, Churchills, and even the monstrous IS-2 filtered in. For now, though, the Pak 40 still reigned in their minds as the king of anti-tank warfare. But the king's crown was already slipping. More often now, they were being sent forward without infantry screens, without overlapping fields of fire, without escape routes. The gun was deadly, but it wasn't magic. Sooner or later, the conditions would shift, and the same weapon that had given them their victories would become the reason so many of them wouldn't survive to see the end. In the next part, we'll step into that shift. When the war turned, when enemy armor came in greater numbers than the Pak 40 could ever destroy, and when the casualty rates began to climb toward that grim 80%. By early 1944, the front was moving the wrong way. The victories that had once defined the Pak 40's reputation were now swallowed up by the sound of retreating columns and the grind of Soviet offensives. Where once the gun had been brought forward to break an attack, now it was dragged from one collapsing position to another, often with no time to prepare. The enemy had changed. The T-34-85 was now the standard Soviet medium tank. Its new 85mm gun could pierce the Pak-40's thin shield and kill the crew with a single hit, even from long range. Alongside them rolled the IS-2 heavy tank, its massive 122mm shells turning anti-tank positions into smoking craters with frightening ease. And they came in numbers that defied belief. Platoons of tanks became companies, companies became battalions. Kramer's battery, once deployed in carefully chosen ambush sites, now found themselves firing from roadsides, half-dug ditches, even barnyards. In one engagement near Vitebsk, they were ordered to cover a withdrawal along an open field. There was no high ground, no defilade, no time to dig in. They unhitched the Pak-40, swung it toward the tree line, and opened fire on the first T-34-85s to break cover. The first two shots hit, but the return fire was instant. A shell exploded just short of their gun, spraying hot fragments through the crew. Ernst, the loader, dropped without a sound. Another blast caved in the left wheel of the carriage, locking the gun in place. Kramer kept firing until the breech jammed, then shouted for the survivors to run. They left the weapon in the mud, breech block destroyed by a grenade. Losses like that became routine. The more the front disintegrated, the more desperate the orders became. Guns were committed without infantry support. Sometimes the only cover was a shallow depression in the ground. Air attacks were constant. The thin gun shield was worthless against the strafing runs of Il-2 Sturmovix. Crews learned to listen for the distant drone of aircraft and throw themselves flat, though it rarely helped. The casualty numbers told the story. Entire batteries were wiped out in a single day. Replacements came in. Boys barely out of training, often with no more than a week's experience on the weapon. They could load and fire, but they didn't know how to survive. Many never got the chance to learn. And yet, even in these hopeless conditions, the Pak-40 could still bite. In Kovel, Kramer's battered crew knocked out 4 enemy tanks in 10 minutes from a position hidden in a burned-out factory. But the counterattack came fast, and without infantry to screen for them, Soviet troops closed in with grenades and anti-tank rifles. The Pak-40's sides were its soft underbelly. A single armor-piercing bullet could punch through and kill everyone inside the shield. Retreat was no guarantee of survival. Moving a Pak-40 under fire meant dragging 1.5 tons of steel over mud, snow, or shattered roads. If the towing truck was destroyed, the crew had to choose between abandoning the gun or dying beside it. Too often, pride or orders kept them in place until it was too late. The change was complete. The Pak-40 was no longer the hunter. It was bait, and its crews knew it. They fought anyway, because there was no other choice. Behind them lay their own retreating comrades. Ahead of them, the Soviet armored tide. In the next part, we'll step inside the minds of these crews, how they endured the knowledge that every new position might be their last, and what it was like to live under the constant shadow of an 80% fatality rate. By 1944, survival in a Pak-40 crew wasn't about skill alone. It was about luck, timing, and the cruel mathematics of war. Every man who manned the gun knew the numbers. Most didn't speak them aloud, but they could see them in the empty bunks after each battle, in the names scratched off rosters, in the constant arrival of new faces that rarely lasted a month. Life in a gun crew was measured in hours between engagements. You might spend 2 days digging in a position, covering the approach to a bridge or crossroads, only to be overrun within minutes when the enemy finally came. Food was whatever could be carried. Black bread, cold tinned meat, sometimes nothing but boiled potatoes stolen from a nearby field. Sleep was snatched in freezing holes beside the gun, wrapped in a damp blanket that smelled of oil and cordite. The work never stopped. In quiet moments, You maintained the weapon, swabbing the barrel, checking the breech, greasing the traversing mechanism. You camouflaged the position with branches, earth, anything to break the outline. You dug shallow trenches to store shells within easy reach. Every movement was about shaving seconds off the time between target spotted and first shot fired. Because seconds were life. The mental pressure was relentless. Every noise mattered. The distant rumble of engines might mean tanks, or it might mean nothing. But you listened anyway, hand tightening on the gun's traverse handle. The sharp buzz of aircraft engines overhead could send a crew diving into the mud, covering their heads as machine gun rounds chewed through the ground around them. Veterans like Kramer learned to read the battlefield. The way dust rose in certain places, the angle of sunlight on moving metal, even the pattern of enemy artillery fire. But no amount of experience could change the fact that the Pak-40 was a static weapon. Once you were seen, you were a target until you were dead or gone. Morale varied wildly. Some men grew fatalistic, treating each engagement as if it were their last, because it probably was. Others clung to the belief that skill and discipline could beat the odds. New recruits were often the most hopeful, but also the most likely to die quickly. The veterans watched them with a mix of pity and resignation. There were unspoken rituals. Crews would sometimes scratch their names into the wooden trail of the gun, a mark that might outlast them. Before major attacks, some men would quietly hand over letters or personal effects to comrades in other units, asking them to send them home if. They rarely said when, though most thought it. The psychological strain was compounded by isolation. Many positions were set far ahead of friendly infantry, cut off except for the occasional messenger or supply run. Radios were rare, and even when they worked, orders were often outdated by the time they arrived. Crews fought in small, lonely battles, often with no idea what was happening even a kilometer away. And yet, in these conditions, bonds formed that were deeper than most soldiers ever knew. You depended on the man next to you for your life, not in some abstract way, but in the literal sense that his speed in loading, his accuracy in aiming, his nerve under fire determined whether you lived another 5 minutes. By late '44, even the most hardened crews were fraying. Continuous retreat, endless losses, and the arrival of better armored enemy tanks had turned every engagement into a gamble with long odds. The enemy no longer feared the Pak-40 as they once had. They respected it. But they also knew how to flank it, how to bury it under artillery, how to kill it from the air. Still, the crews fought on. They had no illusions left, only duty and the grim satisfaction of taking as many enemy tanks as they could before the inevitable. They were not heroes in their own minds, just men doing a job that offered almost no way out. In the final part, we'll follow them into the war's last weeks, when the front collapsed entirely, and the Pak-40's legend was sealed in blood. By the spring of 1945, the map of Germany was shrinking by the week. The Red Army was at the Oder. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine, and every road east or west seemed to carry retreating columns. For the Pak-40 crews, there was no safe rear area left. Every position was a temporary island in a sea that was rising fast. Kramer's crew, now on its 3rd gun in as many months, was sent to hold a crossroads outside a small village in Brandenburg. The order was simple and final: hold until relieved. Everyone knew that relief meant either the end of the war or the end of the crew. They set the gun behind a collapsed farmhouse wall, sight lines open across the muddy road. They had 20 shells left, most armor-piercing, a few high explosive. There was no infantry screen, no mines, just the Pak-40, a towed generator for the radio that barely worked, and 3 men who had already buried too many friends. The Soviets came in the early afternoon. First the sound, then the shapes. T-34-85s, their guns already turning toward the village. Kramer's first shot hit the lead tank in the side, stopping it dead in the road. The second shot crippled another, but the rest kept coming. Shells crashed into the village, collapsing what was left of the walls around them. Shrapnel ripped through the air like angry bees. Loader Schmidt screamed when a fragment tore across his shoulder. But he kept feeding shells into the breach, blood smearing the brass casings. One tank veered off the road, flanking toward their position. Kramer swung the gun hard, fired, and watched the turret lift in a burst of flame. But another Soviet shell smashed into the gun shield, ripping through the thin steel and punching into the traverse gear. The Pak-40 was crippled, unable to track left or right. They kept firing at what they could see. 2 more tanks burned on the road before their ammunition ran out. Kramer pulled the last shell from the ready rack, a high explosive, and fired it at a group of advancing infantry. The blast bought them seconds, maybe less. With the Soviets closing in, Kramer pulled the grenade from his belt, jammed it into the breach, and kicked the crew back. The explosion shattered the gun's mechanism, leaving only twisted metal. They ran through the smoke, slipping in mud and blood, with small arms fire snapping past their ears. They didn't make it far. Schmidt fell first, hit in the back. The others dragged him as far as a ditch, where they lay gasping, surrounded by the sounds of engines and shouting in Russian. For many Pak-40 crews, this was how it ended. Not in the grand battles they'd trained for, but in small, brutal fights where survival was measured in minutes. Out of more than 20,000 men who served these guns during the war, roughly 4 out of 5 never came home. The Pak-40 itself earned a place in military history as one of the most effective anti-tank weapons ever built. But its success was paid for in lives. The lives of crews who fought in open fields, narrow streets, and frozen forests, knowing that each shot they fired might be their last. As the war ended, the surviving guns were scrapped, captured, or sent to arm the victors. The men who survived scattered back to what was left of their homes, carrying the weight of those they'd lost. For them, the sound of the 75mm firing would never be just a memory. It would always be the sound of friends dying beside them. That is why, when we speak of the Pak-40, we don't just talk about armor penetration or kill counts. We remember the men behind the breach, the ones who made it deadly, and the ones who never walked away from it. Subscribe, hit like, and tell us in the comments which untold stories of the battlefield you want to hear next.